I'm glad you could join me on this interview.
Yeah, after after dragging you along for a little bit.
I know. Well, thanks so much. Let's jump right into it with a little on your background.
Yeah, so I started 9 5 to Freedom as a brand about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And the whole idea behind it was I was going to start a blog. I had started working on building another business, and I thought, well, I'm in the beginning stages, like, why not create this other brand where I can kind of show people the progress and what I'm doing to kind of build it up. Big focus of mine at the beginning was SEO, so a lot of the content that I talk about is like getting a website built, SEO, kind of in that realm. But when it came to podcasting, or when it came to blogging, I was so inconsistent. Like, writing just wasn't a huge, I don't know, I just didn't get a whole lot of joy out of doing it. It felt like more of a chore than anything. So I was super inconsistent, didn't really post frequently enough. There was like a stint where I probably didn't post a blog post for like 4 months. I was like, I should probably do this again. So everything that I've done at this point has been kind of like free content. And my goal is to bring more people into that brand, show them what I'm doing, and hopefully be able to start creating courses and doing that type of stuff. And since I wasn't getting a lot of traction there, I thought, okay, I'll do video. Video was a disaster. I was terrible at the beginning. So quickly gave up on that. And then I kind of fell into podcasting. My wife was like, I had talked about wanting to start a podcast eventually. And we were actually listening to another podcast where the guy was saying, well, like, take podcasting, for example. Like, just go out and do it, start it. If no one listens, who cares? But like, just get started, like, start doing something. And that really kind of resonated with me. I was like, all right, yeah. I mean, I plan to do it when I had an audience. I don't have an audience really yet, but I mean, what's the worst that could happen? If anything, like, I'll just get to interview people, and that's that. So after I started getting a few people lined up for the interviews, people saying yes, I was like, okay, I guess we're going for it. And then just started running and going, and haven't been stopping since. It's been the most consistent content creation I've had for a while.
Oh, that's amazing. So do you still have the blog?
Yes.
Is that the blog that you're podcasting out of?
Yeah, so it's still the same brand. The 95tofreedom.com is the overall like umbrella brand, and I just kind of have the podcast rolled up into that. So since doing the podcast, I've actually been able to blog a lot more since starting. Initially, when I started the podcast, I would have a show notes page, and I know the importance of SEO, so I know the content needs to be on the page. So my show notes pages would be pretty lengthy because I'd create basically a mini blog post inside each show notes page. And I got to thinking about it because I was like, well, I'd really like to have other content. And I started thinking about, like, okay, if someone comes to my website, like, say I am ranking for something, I bring on a guest, we talk about how to start a blog. If they come to my page and the very first thing they see is a podcast episode, they're probably going to turn away because they might not be looking for a podcast episode. And they might not scroll down to see that I have a whole like tutorial on how to start a blog or something like that. So I was like, I guess really what I need to do is break that up, put that into its own blog post, have a really slimmed down show notes page, and then I can direct people from the blog to the podcast.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So now I started breaking it up. I'm not doing any more work than I was before. It's still the same amount of work, but now I have 2 pieces of content to publish instead of 1. And then running with that same concept, I started implementing video content that I'm pulling from the podcast. And I'm publishing that to YouTube, and then I embed that on the blog post or the show notes page so that people can catch just like little clips of the podcast as well. So I went from publishing like 1 podcast episode a week to now publishing 3 to 5 high quality pieces of content, without really any extra added work on top of it.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing, actually. Now, let me go back to why you got into podcasting in the first place. I see your background is in project management.
Mm-hmm.
Is that project management with the construction industry? And do you still work a full-time job while trying to grow your podcast? And
Yeah.
what are your plans as you go ahead?
Yeah, so right now I am still working a 9 to 5 job. It's actually normally it's like six 6 days a week, 60 hours a week.
Oh wow.
Right now we're kind of at a lull, kind of have a break in construction because that's what I'm construction project manager. And yeah, right now I'm kind of doing it all on the side. The whole idea behind setting up the 9 to 5 to Freedom brand, kind of working on the entrepreneurship stuff, was to eventually be able to leave that. I've learned a lot from being a project manager and kind of going through that. I think it's really helped me in terms of like staying on track and setting schedules for myself and being productive and automating a lot of the stuff that I do, systemizing everything. But it's not something that I really want to do the rest of my life. It's the idea of control
Mm-hmm.
and the lack of control in a 9 to 5 job that I really don't like.
Oh yeah.
And in a business that I own, I'm the one in control. So I can determine how much I get paid. I can determine when I take time off. If I want to make more money next month, I can put in more effort and make more money. If I don't want to make more money, I can chill and just work with what I have. Like I have that flexibility, and it's all kind of on myself. I'm not relying on someone else to tell me what I can and can't do or what I can and can't make.
That's very interesting. That's I find that a lot of people I've talked to come into working for themselves just because of the flexibility that it allows you in terms of controlling your life and your income. It's usually not just for the income, but more like for controlling the way that your life is going to be, your life focus, more or less. So let's see, what is, so you got into podcasting. What area did you start with? What niche did you start in? And are you still in the niche that you started with?
Yeah, so I knew when I started the podcast, I knew I wanted to interview other entrepreneurs. And I want to do that for a couple different reasons. One, I'm still in a 9 to 5 job, so I'm still learning. I'm still trying to figure it out. So by interviewing people that are already doing it, it kind of gives me a slight advantage because now I have a platform to bring the people on, ask them the questions that I want to ask them, get the information I want to get, and then two, it is also beneficial for anybody else who might be in the same boat as me, either just getting started or trying to figure it out as they go. Now is a platform where they can come and they can listen to those experts as well. And when I say experts, I guess that's kind of somewhat loosely defined because the people that I bring on the show, some of them are like well-established 6-figure, 7-figure earners. Others are maybe they had just gotten started. Maybe they just hit their first $10,000 a month, like $10,000 a month. There we go. And then some of them, like I interviewed one girl early on in the podcast, and she was just in the process of trying to start her own private practice in the therapy space. So I interviewed her. She was still trying to figure it out, and now she's actually full-time focusing on her private practice. So I'm working to get her back on the show because it's going to be kind of like an update. Last time we interviewed you, you were in the process, and now you're there. Like, how's it going? That type of stuff. So it really ranges from like experience level and where everyone's at in their business, just because the listeners, I mean, who knows where they are in the journey. They could be at the very beginning. Maybe they're just a few steps further. I want to be able to kind of attract and bring in people and have something for everybody in that aspect. And yeah, I'm still, since I started, I just published episode 40 yesterday. So almost every episode's been an interview. I had a few where I just pop on like some special episodes, like episode 50 is going to end up being just me on the episode. But for the most part, every single episode's an interview with some kind of expert or professional in their own regard.
It's amazing the amount of genius you can get from both sides of the expertise. I actually don't call anybody a non-expert because I've learned so much. It's no secret that I'm just starting out with my own podcast too.
Yeah.
And I've learned so much from people that are just getting into it. I've learned from people that are struggling with their podcasts, as well as from seasoned people. So there's so much information, and it's just genius to talk to the experts, and ask direct questions. So I like that. Now,
And what's cool with the podcast is that, like, when I started the blog, if I was reaching out to these people, I wouldn't really have much to offer them. I'd just be ask, and I wouldn't really have much to give in return. Whereas with a podcast, you have a platform. Like, that is something that you have to offer. So I can reach out to someone who I have no business talking to and say, hey, I have a podcast. I'd love to share your story with my audience. And that's more exposure to them. They're getting put in front of more people because they're on my show. So that is me giving a little bit of something back, and then me being able to pull information and extract information from them at the same time. So it's really cool because podcasting really gives you an avenue to connect with people that I say that I should have no business connecting with.
That's interesting. Talking about platforms, what platform do you use to run your podcast?
So I go through hosting, which is Buzzsprout.
Buzzsprout, okay.
Yep. I think I found that basically through Pat Flynn's recommendation. So when I was getting started, I went through a lot of the free resources that he had for starting a podcast, and that's where I kind of got into it. Since using it and hearing what other people have said about some of the other ones like Libsyn and I think Podbean, and there's a couple others, it sounds like there is a little bit of, I think Libsyn is a little bit more technical. Some people I've heard have a little bit of confusion with it, whereas Buzzsprout seems like it was like super easy. Like, I uploaded my podcast, got them all good to go within a matter of like a half hour, and it's easy to just jump in and do it. I don't know what they offer functionality wise as opposed to some of the other ones because I haven't played with them, but I haven't had no issues with Buzzsprout, so I'm probably going to be sticking with them for a while.
That's wonderful. Now, what about editing? That seems to be a challenge for everyone. What do you do for your editing?
So I actually use Adobe Audition,
which
is a paid platform. I know a lot of people use Audacity. I had always had experience with Adobe programs growing up. My dad always played with Photoshop, and that kind of introduced me into it. So I was familiar with all of that, and I don't know. With YouTube, you can learn pretty much anything.
Oh yeah.
So when I was getting started with it, I spent a lot of time on YouTube learning how to edit, and it's kind of difficult because everyone tells you to do something a little bit differently. Like, their process is different than everyone else's, so I just kind of pulled different pieces and aspects from all the different videos to kind of find a process that works for me. And now that I kind of got it nailed down, I went from all my episodes are about 45 minutes to an hour long. The first couple episodes, it took me probably to finish it all, at least 5 to 8 hours to edit a single episode. Like, it was so slow. And now that I kind of nailed down that process, I can knock out a 45-minute, hour-long episode in like an hour and a half, like start to finish.
Okay. So, in your opinion, what's involved in running a successful podcast?
I'm still figuring that out. I think for sure consistency. So consistency is by far the most important thing you can do. I can't remember the exact stats, but it's pretty crazy how many people don't get past episode 10. Okay. There was a podcast I was listening to, and they brought on, I think it was one of the owners of Buzzsprout or one of the CEOs or something like that, and he shared some stats, and one of the stats he shared was there's, I think, close to 2 million podcasts out there right now. And of those 2 million podcasts, there's only about 375,000 podcasts that have actually published an episode in the last 90 days.
Wow.
So going from 2 million podcasts to 375 is a huge drop off.
That's actually.
Which I see that as a huge opportunity. If there's only 375,000 people that are actively posting and publishing on a podcast platform, like, you look at a blog, like how many people have a blog, how many people have a YouTube channel. Trying to compete at those levels is very difficult. But when you're only competing with less than 500,000 people, there's a huge potential there to really let the thing go. Podcasting is still super young. So consistency, one, is tough at the beginning. It's going to suck. I'm not going to sugarcoat that at all. But as you continue doing it, it gets easier. You start figuring out processes. And then two, leverage other people's audience. I think a lot of people, they do start the podcast as like a solo show.
Mm-hmm.
Think, oh, I have something to say, so I'm going to get up on there and say it. That's great. It gets people familiar with you and able to connect with you. But your audience can only extend as far as your audience goes. And how are you actually going to grow that audience? By leveraging other people's audiences. It's like the best way to do it. So if you can bring on people that do have a little bit more following than you, or not even more of a following, if they just have any kind of social media presence or presence online, and you bring them on the show, if they share that show, now you're exposed to their entire audience. So I have 40 episodes in, about 38 of them are interviews. Now my podcast is exposed to 38 other people's audiences. Some of them are large, some of them are not, but it doesn't matter. I still have that exposure. And I mean, you get some people who will blast your podcast episode all over social media and have a decent following and start pulling people over from those audiences. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
it compounds every episode, every interview that you do. You just keep exposing yourself to more and more. Like the impressions go through the roof. And then finally, I'm dabbling with some paid like advertising inside podcasting. So I have some spots that I'm trying to get on with some other apps, some podcasting apps, and I don't think that hits either in like May or June because they were booked like way out. So I'm gonna see how that goes. They claim that within like the half a month or month that they're going to be running the ad, that I can pick up anywhere between 30 to 100 subscribers in that time frame. So I'm really curious to see how that goes. That was something that Jay Klaus kind of talked about with his. I think he started back in March of last year, March of 2020, and he broke 500,000 downloads already.
Wow.
He's just over a year old and at 500,000, probably way beyond that by now.
Hmm.
But someone asked him like how he saw such a huge spike out of nowhere, because it was like you saw the little tick for downloads and all of a sudden like went through the roof.
Okay.
And he said getting featured on some of those podcast platforms is what really blew his podcast up.
That's amazing. That's anybody's dream.
Yeah, right.
Now, how did you launch your podcast? What process did you use to launch your podcast?
Yeah, so I've actually worked with a couple people helping them get theirs launched, and I did it a little bit differently with them than I did myself. So for mine, I set myself a goal. So you have to have that end goal. When are you going to actually launch this thing? And I set the date without knowing anything about how to do it. Like I did a little bit of research on equipment and that type of stuff, but that was it. I set a 45-day goal, and I basically listed out, kind of created like a mind map essentially. And okay, what are all the different aspects that I need to have this podcast launched? Okay, well, I need to book some interviews. I need the equipment. I need the hosting. I need the editing software and figure out how to edit. I need a cover art, and I need a place on my website to put the show notes, essentially. And from there, I just took like each one of those. I took like one or two from every single like bucket, and I would assign it like, okay, week 1, I'm going to focus on this. Week 2, I'm going to focus on this. And I didn't try to overwhelm myself. I didn't say, okay, I'm going to try to get 5 things done this week. It was like, I'm going to get 1 thing done this week.
Okay.
And if I have time and I'm feeling ambitious, maybe I'll get to number 2. But I stuck to that really rigid schedule because it wasn't overwhelming, only focusing on 1 or 2 things a week. And I was actually, by the time the podcast was ready to go, it was actually ahead of schedule. But now, one thing I didn't do very well that I think will help, especially right at the very beginning for growing a podcast, is setting up some kind of launch group, like a pre-launch Facebook group. This one girl, it's actually my wife's sister. Her and her friends wanted to start a podcast. So I kind of helped them get rolling. And I told them to start a Facebook page, start inviting people, bring people into that Facebook page, get them all amped up for it. We had a quicker timeline. I think we launched in like 3 weeks. And from that Facebook page, they ended up getting like 300 people on their Facebook page before they launched.
Oh, wow.
So they already had 300 people that were like excited for the podcast to go live. And that was something I didn't do very well at the very beginning. Like I kind of half-assed the launch group. But looking at the success that they had and seeing how good of a jump they got right at the very beginning, I wish I would have spent more time on that. So when I help people get their podcast going, that's like the first thing I say is like start a Facebook page tonight and start inviting people to it and get them excited.
I remember you saying that to me.
Yeah, that was probably, it just kind of blew my mind how they grew so quickly on that Facebook page. And I mean, that's an easy audience to target and say, hey, the podcast is live, or like 10 days till it goes live, 9 days, like we're getting close, like how cool is this? They started running some giveaways and stuff like that, like kind of building up hype for it. But yeah, it went really well for them.
That's nice to know. Now, how many episodes did you have ready before you launched? And how many do you recommend?
Nope, I'm sorry. You cut out at the beginning there, was it?
I'm sorry, okay. How many episodes did you have ready before you launched? And how many do you recommend that a new person to this should have before they get started?
Yeah, I would definitely say have at least 2 to 3 minimum. 3 probably would be the better number. Obviously, the more you have at the beginning, the better. I guess the first question you want to ask yourself is, what's the frequency that you're going to release this podcast? Is it going to be weekly? Is it going to be daily? Are you going to release a week? I would definitely get a couple weeks worth of podcast episodes done. If you get like a full month ahead, if it's a weekly podcast and you have 4 episodes done right out of the gate, I think that's great. But one thing to consider when you do launch, like on your launch day or whatever, I would have at least 2 to 3 of those episodes launch day 1. Because if someone finds your podcast and they see episode 1 and all it is like an intro to the podcast and, hey, next week we're going to have our first interview, like how exciting is that? Okay, that's cool, but you kind of may have lost their attention at that point. If they can read or listen to that first like little intro episode and then jump right into the first full episode and kind of get a feel for what the podcast is about, that's where you're going to kind of like get them to stick with you. So definitely have a few launched on day 1, and then if you can get a month ahead, that's probably where I'd stick around in that range.
Great advice. Now, you've been doing this for a couple years.
I just launched back in July. Yeah.
Okay. So, what challenges have you encountered, and which ones have you overcome?
So the consistency, I would say it's not something that I struggled with in a sense. Like I was very dedicated to making this happen. So I've been very persistent with my consistency. I make sure that the episode goes live every week is basically what it comes down to. So, I mean, like I said, that's probably the most important thing you should focus on if you were serious about the podcast, like being consistent. It was a big struggle at the beginning just because it took so much time. So being able to systemize that, looking for quicker ways to edit the podcast. There's some functions within Adobe Audition, which is why I love it and have stuck with it, not like dropped back to a free version of it at all, that allows you to like trim silences. So when I talk, especially at the beginning of the podcast, I think I've gotten better at it, maybe not, but when I would talk, I would leave long gaps in my sentences or like be in between words. So I'd talk and then I'd continue on and then I'd do that. And it was just like, it wouldn't sound natural. So with Audition, what you can actually do is trim out. You can say like anything that doesn't have words, like shorten that silence up by like so many milliseconds. So now instead of it sounding like I'm pausing in between all my words and my sentences and stuff like that, it kind of truncated it all. and smush it all together, and it sounds like a more like flowing conversation, not just me thinking of what I'm trying to say next. So stuff like that, and then being able to speed up the audio playback so that you can just, an hour-long episode now becomes 30 minutes. Listening to it in double time really helps speed that up.
Okay.
And then I guess getting the guests is probably another big challenge. But I noticed at the very beginning it was difficult. And then after I broke about 10 episodes, 12 episodes right around there, then people started contacting me. And I actually had to stop taking guests now for a while because I have way too many episodes recorded. And I think right now I have enough episodes to get me all the way into August, which is
that's
too far out.
That's impressive. Now, 38 of your episodes are guest interviews, right? Mm-hmm. How do you go about finding guests for your podcast?
So I did an episode with Matt. I think it's Matt Stromberg. I'll have to send you his last name. It was a long one. And we talked about that. So social media was the big thing. Reaching out on social media. But before I even did that, I reached out to people that I knew. People that I went to school with or played baseball with in the past that I knew were like kind of starting their own businesses or had their own businesses. And got them booked, interviewed them, and then I started reaching out on social media within the communities that I followed on social media. It all kind of fit with the brand and the type of interview shows that I wanted to do. So I got them on board. And then after I started getting a couple and they were sharing it, then people started coming to me. And then it was kind of a mix of me reaching out to people and then other people reaching out to me. And then I was constantly able to keep a steady flow of guests. But one thing anybody could do that's super easy, when you get a guest on your show, after you're done with the show, ask them if they have anybody else that they know who might be interested in coming on your podcast. Leverage, like I said, leverage other people's audiences. So if I'm interviewing other entrepreneurs, chances are they know other entrepreneurs. They're not just completely doing it on their own. So if they can get me in contact with other people, then I can reach out to them and say, hey, I just featured Christine on my podcast. She recommended you, said you'd make a great guest for the show. Is that something you'd be interested in? They know you. They're like, oh, Christine was on the podcast. Like, I trust Christine. Yeah, sure, I'll come on the podcast. It kind of builds up that credibility, even though you don't have any kind of relationship with them at all. And then probably the last one, I haven't had to use this yet, but I'm excited to use it, is Amazon. And more specifically, like Amazon Books. So if you go into the book section on Amazon, they have a coming soon section. And what you can do is find all the books that are coming out in the next month or two. And they're going to be wanting to promote the hell out of their book. So if you reach out to them and say, hey, like I have this podcast, think you'd be a perfect fit for it. We can bring you on. We can talk about your book. We can talk about everything you're doing. They're probably going to be all on board for it because it's just more exposure for them in their book that's coming out. So that's one I haven't done yet myself because I've been so backlogged with everything. But it'd be a good way also to kind of get either well-established brands or well-established people. Like I just booked John Lee Dumas on my podcast.
Wow, that's
he just released a book.
Yep.
So he's promoting it all over the place. If I just reached out to him any other time, he probably would have said no. But because he's got that book going, and he's going on book tours, stuff like that, it's going to be a quick interview. I think he said he's got like 15 minutes or something. But
10
still,
minutes.
Getting John. Yeah, exactly. That's my thought. So being able to leverage people that are like trying to release something or coming out with something new and they're wanting to promote it and get the word out about it is definitely a great way to go. And I think Amazon is just an easy way to kind of check that box.
So do you charge do you charge guests to come on your podcast?
No, I don't. I've heard of some people doing that. I don't know if I fully agree. Mm-hmm. In a way, like, yeah, I'm giving them a platform to come on, but at the same time, like, they're doing a favor by coming on my show. So it's like there's already kind of like an exchange of goods in a sense that way. I wouldn't feel right, one, asking someone to come on my podcast and then them saying yes and saying, okay, cool. Well, now I need you to pay me $50 in order to come on my show. I don't know, something about that I don't really agree with.
I just found it interesting when I was speaking to some of the people I interviewed for this post. Some of them were charging guests to come on their podcast, and I just I don't know what I feel about it yet. But it's working for them, so
yeah. And I mean, I guess I could see, like, if you got to a certain level where you just had so many guests that you didn't know what to do with, I could see it as like a little extra monetization strategy, kind of like blog posts. Like if people do guest blog posts, I've seen like, yeah, you can do a guest blog post on my site, but we're going to charge you $25 to do it, or $50 or whatever.
Yeah, that's true.
It's I don't know. For me, I'm just not a fan of it, I guess.
Okay. Maybe if you had to, maybe that this is what I thought. Talking to people, I'm like, maybe they have such a huge audience, or why would I pay to go on somebody's show? Mm-hmm. Probably because of the exposure that they're going to offer me. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Still something that I just stumbled into, mm-hmm. that people are doing, and I'm not sure what I think about it yet. So I thought I'd ask you. So how do you monetize? How do you monetize your podcast?
So I'm not at the moment.
Okay.
I think so. Right now, I'm actually working on my online course, which is going to be geared towards podcasters. I don't know. At some point, I want to eventually like directly monetize the podcast. But I'm not going to worry about rushing that just yet. Mm-hmm. I'm still trying to get the exposure, get more people, get more eyeballs on it, more ears, I guess. So I'm really looking towards other ways of monetizing my brand and making income on the side before focusing on monetizing the podcast specifically. Mm-hmm. My thought is if I have listeners that are interested in starting a podcast, maybe they're interested in my course. So it's kind of indirectly monetizing it, I guess.
Okay.
But then sponsorships, I know, is a huge topic and something that I've been considering and looking into. But I haven't had the time to kind of build out what I want that to look like and how I'm going to do it. But if anybody is like new to podcasting, you don't need a big following. I've seen people that don't have a very large podcast still make money from it with sponsorship packages. I'd say the biggest tip through all of that is don't think of your podcast as just a podcast. That's what I was doing. I was like, okay, if I'm going to monetize it, I'm going to put a 30-second ad clip. Someone's going to pay for that 30-second ad clip. If it's a new podcast, maybe 10 people listen to it. Okay, well, someone's not going to pay me very much for that ad spot if they pay me at all. Think of your podcast as a media brand. So if you're going to work with people and you're going to get sponsors for your podcast, don't just offer them a 30-second podcast spot. Offer them social media coverage, YouTube coverage, show notes coverage, something where they're not just getting a 30-second spot once a week for the next however many months. It's not that valuable. If you're producing social media and their logos on so many of your social media posts and you're promoting their stuff and you're almost acting like almost like a freelance marketer for that company in a sense, that's going to be much more valuable. And they're probably going to be willing to pay you a lot more for that because they can run ads. They can spend $10,000 in ads a month and have to create the content. But if you're creating the content for them, they might be willing to give you $1,000 or $2,000 a month of that ad budget for you to basically help promote what they're doing.
Yeah. Now, it seems like there's so many moving pieces to having a podcast that actually works. How do you tie all of that together?
Are you talking like everything beyond the actual podcast itself?
Everything you need to do to keep your podcast successful.
So, I mean, I think it really depends on the show. I mean, you have some shows that get super popular and they don't even have a website. They don't have any place for show notes or any of that. Maybe they have a Facebook page where people can go to, and that's about it. And they are successful. But I've kind of taken the approach of be everywhere as much as I can be, but it didn't start like that. So like I mentioned earlier, I was publishing a podcast a week. I had my show notes page, and that was really about it. I would do podcast, social media, and the show notes, which depending on how crazy you want to go, it could be a lot. I'm very much in the business of simplifying my life and optimizing everything and automating as much as possible. So I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time outside of the actual podcast episode itself.
So, surprise me and my audience. Tell me one thing that you never expected out of your podcast that somebody coming into podcasting would never expect to either encounter or have to deal with in any way or even benefit from.
I think something that anyone can benefit from in having a podcast. I mean, since starting it, I didn't realize it at the beginning. For me, it was just a way that I was like, okay, I'm going to try to grow an audience with a podcast. I'm going to try to monetize a podcast. Like maybe I'll blow up or something. But since starting it, it's not even been about as much getting the audience as it has like interviewing the people. The relationships that I've built with some of these guests that I bring on has been awesome. I'm in contact with them sometimes almost daily. Others, I mean, I had one guest the other day reach out to me and said, hey, I just interviewed someone on my podcast. I thought he'd be a good fit for your show. Like, let me know what you think. Get you guys in contact. As I've interviewed all these people, the biggest thing that they contributed to their success, or one of the biggest factors to their success, has been the relationships and the networking. And the podcast is a great way to build relationships and network with people. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're able to connect with people who you have no business connecting with, people that are on a whole nother level above you, that's where else are you going to be able to build that kind of relationship aside from accidentally running into them at a coffee shop and straightening up a conversation, really hitting it off? Like with a podcast, you have their full attention for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, however it is. And you can kind of build that relationship up and then stay in contact with them afterwards, ask how things are going. Like you're building a real genuine relationship with these people inside your industry. And I think the relationship building side of it has been by far the greatest benefit out of anything, because I'm very much an introverted person. I don't go out of my way to make a bunch of friends. Like I know the importance of it. I understand it, but like I've never really attended conferences or done any of that stuff. I'd like to now, but getting on the podcast and interviewing people, I've been able to actually build relationships with people, help them, they can help me. Like it's been amazing. And again, you're opened up to their network at that point. Once you build that relationship, like they're going to want to send people your way that can help you, and vice versa. You're going to send people their way that can help them. Like your community and your network just expands dramatically once you start interviewing guests and bringing them on.
Interestingly, I talked to someone that works with introvert entrepreneurs.
Kim?
Yeah, Kim Beasley. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So she was a good one actually, because she had a whole different perspective to.
Yeah, she came on my show. Oh shoot, sorry. Maybe episode 28 or 29. So yeah, she was a fun one to talk with. And
your audio just went down.
Can you hear me now?
Let's see.
Now can you hear me?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. Yeah, I had her on episode like 28 or 29 of the podcast, and she was a really fun one to interview. She's
amazing. She has so much knowledge up there. So yeah, she was a good one. You talked about being an introvert, and I'm like, okay, that's a Kim topic right there.
Oh yeah, that was a fun one, because that's very much. I think she used the term on the show. She used the term ambivert, which is kind of like you're an introvert, but you can be extroverted when you have to, and that's kind of where I stand. I think if it's up to me, I'm probably gonna stay in my lane. But if someone comes to me and approaches me, then I can kind of open up and be a little bit more extroverted. But yeah, I'm not gonna set myself up and put myself in the position to be an extrovert, if that makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's see. One advice that you'd give to someone coming into this? Would you tell them to turn around and run? Or
No, I mean, I would say getting, so for one, everyone starts a podcast thinking it's going to cost a lot of money. You think like, oh, there's equipment involved, there's all this stuff. It's not, you're not creating videos. You don't need fancy camera equipment. Microphones are super cheap. I got mine for $60 on Amazon, and it's a really good mic for $60. Like, it would probably compete with some of the Yeti mics out there that are $200. So the cost of starting a podcast is not that high. So don't let that deter you from actually getting started. And finally, just get started. From someone who was terrified to do it and said, oh, I'm going to do that like way down the road when I have a big audience and people care what I have to say. Like, the podcast can be a platform for you to build that audience. You will attract people from your podcast, and they're going to find you because of that. And you're building a much better relationship with them up front because they're hearing your voice. They're being able to connect with you on another level versus just like content on a page. If you're a blogger, you start blogging, for me at least, it's hard to get my personality out there. On a podcast, you're hearing me talk, you're hearing me interact with people. You kind of get a sense of who I am as a person, even though you've never met me. So I guess lastly, what's the worst that could happen? If you start it and no one listens, no one listens. At least you tried.
yep.
But if you start it and it starts going somewhere, you're going to wish you started it earlier. Like, I wish I had started it earlier. So I would definitely say just get started, stick with it. It's going to be tough at the beginning, but like keep pushing forward and just enjoy it. Like, if you're bringing to interview people on your show, have fun. Interview people you want to interview. Like, it's a blast once you get rolling, and once you kind of get a system down, it's a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for all that insight. Now I need to go and sit down and try to figure out all this information I just got from you. So, but thanks so much for coming on. I'm really happy that you did. I think I got a lot of wisdom out of you, and I'm sure my audience will too.